broadcast on our YouTube channel. But don't worry, only those people who are unmuted and talking in this nice little yellow box will be preserved in the internet. And the second note, the last thing, is just a note of thanks. Thank you so much for your support consistently this year. We've gotten through this, we're getting through this pandemic, and we really appreciate it. So before we hand things over to Rachel, real quick, also please type any questions you have for our authors into the chat, and we will save them and pose them at the end. Thanks. All right, go ahead, take it away, Rachel.
Hi, everybody. Tonight it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome author and historian Jack Kelly to Northshire Live. Jack is a longtime Northshire bookseller favorite, and I realized tonight as I was writing my introduction, he has visited us in the Saratoga Springs store for each of his previous releases, the wonderful books Band of Giants, Heaven's Ditch, and The Edge of Anarchy. It's always a real treat to hear him speak, and so I'm delighted that he's able to join us tonight remotely to talk about his newest book, Valcour, the 1776 campaign that saved the cause of liberty. Tonight, Jack will be interviewed by fellow author Steve Sheinkin, who writes award-winning nonfiction for young people and is the author of The Notorious Benedict Arnold. Please join me in welcoming them both to Northshire Live.
Thank you. Congratulations, Jack, on this.
Thank you.
On this new book. It's really terrific. I think we can agree this story is actually totally pivotal to the revolution and should be better known. We weren't sure if we should call ourselves Benedict Arnold fans, though. I don't know if that's still if that would go over, but it would be great if you could start with I think you have some images, right? And maybe show some images and give us an overview of the.
Yeah, I think to look at a few maps would help
Yes,
to oriented people as to where the story began. I'll just go through a very brief overview of the whole book, and then we can kick off the discussion from there.
Perfect.
Let me just try sharing the screen here. And okay, this is my book is Valcour, the 1776 campaign that saved the cause of liberty. And I make the point that this is the most important unknown battle of the Revolutionary War. And I'll try to explain that as we go along, why I think it was important. And to orient people, in 1776, the British sent their largest expeditionary army in their history across the Atlantic to put down the rebellion. And their target was a corridor that ran from Quebec City up here down the St. Lawrence, down the Richelieu, Lake Champlain, and then down the Hudson River to New York. It was the main access to the interior of America. It was the main path from Canada down into the rebellious colonies. And in particular, it was sort of the back door to New England. So once they got down on the lakes or down up or onto the Hudson River, they could attack eastward into the New England states where the rebellion was really focused. Their strategy was to attack both ends at once. So they sent 10,000 men to Canada and 40,000 men down to New York City. The Patriots understood the strategic significance of that corridor. And they also had two armies, one in New York City, about 20,000 men under George Washington, and one in Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point. The main defenses were in Fort Ticonderoga on the New York side of Lake Champlain. The interesting thing about the whole campaign was that the campaign in the north was basically successful. They did stop the British invasion from coming down from Canada, and the campaign around New York City was a complete debacle, and Washington was forced out of New York and eventually retreated across the Delaware River down here into Pennsylvania. And yet the New York campaign is generally the one that people think of as to what was the action of 1776. Early in the summer of 1776, in July, there began an arms race with the British in St. John's on the Richelieu River up here. It's quite close to Montreal. And the Americans down in Skeensboro, which is now Whitehall, at the very southern tip of Lake Champlain. and both sides were building fleets. So relatively small boats for the Americans. They had gunboats and what they called galleys, which were small sailing boats with cannon on them. And the British were building a bigger fleet up in St. John's. The two fleets came together here at Valcour Island. Benedict Arnold, who was the leader of the American fleet, he'd been a sea captain before the war, went up and sort of challenged the British in the north end of Lake Champlain, and then pulled back to Valcour Island, and that's where he met the British. Valcour Island is about a little less than a mile off the New York coast, and there's a bay in here that he placed his fleet because it was protected and because he would be hidden from the British. The British fleet, this much larger fleet, came down on the morning of October 11th. And I think Arnold understood that they wouldn't sail south on the lake unless the wind was from the north, which is what happened. They had a very brisk wind from the north. So they were coming down from the north, and he let them go past the island down into around in here, and then sent boats out to fire on the British from behind and essentially provoke them to follow him back up into the bay. And that's where the first battle was fought. The Americans had to stretch their boats, and they had 8 gunboats and 3 of these larger galleys. And the British had 22 gunboats stretched across here, and they just fired at each other back and forth for pretty much all day. That was one of the most brutal forms of warfare. It's a cannon battle at sea. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to take cover. You just had to stand there and hope one of these cannonballs didn't hit you. But the Americans were able to hold their own. The larger British ships weren't able to get up into the battle because of the wind. So they were trying to sail north into the wind. And so a lot of the firepower of the British fleet was negated by Benedict Arnold's tactics. Night fell. This is a local artist from Burlington, Ernest Haas, did a number of studies of an artist's rendition of what the battle might look like. This is one of the American galleys, pretty well shot up by the time that the battle started to ease off, and it got dark about 5:30. One of the American gunboats, the Philadelphia, sank. They got the men off, but went down to the bottom. And one of the British gunboats was also sunk. In the night, and this is one of the things that historians still scratch their heads about, Benedict Arnold was able to sneak out of that bay, right through or right past the British fleet. Exactly how he did it is still somewhat mysterious, but he was able to get out and escape down the lake. The British waited till morning, hoping to finish him off in the morning. The Americans had expended most of their ammunition and were just sitting there. And when the sun came up, the Valcour Bay was empty, and they were just flabbergasted. And so they started to chase. Then Americans had a head start, but the British had faster ships, and they went down through the middle part of Lake Champlain and got about to Split Rock, and the battle started again. The British caught up. Some of the American ships were captured. Some were made it down to Crown Point. And Benedict Arnold and 4 of the gunboats he had fought the British through here for about 2.5 hours, and finally had his boats pull into Ferris Bay, which is a tiny little cove in here, and run aground and set them on fire with the flag still flying, so that the British couldn't get them. He refused to surrender. So those boats were destroyed, and he and his men walked out and got down to Crown Point. Then basically nothing happened. The Americans were prepared at Fort Ticonderoga to do battle with the British, and the British never came down. They either because they were stunned by the ferocity of the American opposition, the chutzpah of just standing up to the Royal Navy, or the main reason was that they were aware of how rapidly Lake Champlain could freeze over. And so they didn't want to get stuck in a prolonged siege at Fort Ticonderoga and have the lake freeze behind them. So they decided to go back to Canada and leave it for another year. And one of the points of significance I'd make for the entire campaign was that Benedict Arnold and Horatio Gates, who was the commander at Ticonderoga, marched 600 men down to Pennsylvania, where Washington's army was sitting there waiting. Washington was trying to decide what to do. We don't really know what factors went into his thinking, but having the threat from the North neutralized and having these 600 extra men may have given him the impetus to decide to cross the Delaware River on Christmas night and attack the Hessians at Trenton, and really change the trajectory of the war, restored American morale, and allowed the American patriots to continue. Some of the men who fought at Valcour Island in October also crossed the Delaware with Washington and fought at Trenton. So that was one of the things that made that northern campaign important, even though what we usually hear about is this spectacular coup that Washington pulled off in the South. So that's a basic overview of the story that I tell in the book.
That's great. And one of the, I mean, there's so many exciting things, and I want to get to the bigger picture of how, where this sits in the whole war. But I mean, just to start with a detail that really surprised me in my research, you picture, all right, it's a sea battle. You picture something out of a pirate movie. And the British particularly had some bigger ships, but many of the ships that the Americans had were surprisingly small and wide open. You can go to the Smithsonian. I'm sure many people have seen one of them that was retrieved from Lake Champlain, the Philadelphia. And it looks like a big rowboat.
Yeah, the gunboats essentially were oversized rowboats.
Yeah.
The thing about them was that they had flat bottoms, so they were very easy to build because of that. But they were hard to sail. They did have a sail. They had a one mast and a sail, but because they had no keel, they had to really the wind had to be from directly behind them in order to sail. But the fact that they could be rowed made a difference in fighting on the lake. And I think that what you talk about is interesting because people always do think of Horatio Hornblower and fighting out on the ocean and these big ships with the rows and rows of cannon. The British had one of those ships, a frigate that did have quite a serious broadside of 12-pounder cannon. But most of their ships were gunboats, and they had a couple of schooners. But you have to remember how narrow Lake Champlain is, how difficult it is to sail, particularly the bigger ships in a lake where the wind shifts quite often, where an island or trees can make block the wind or veer off in another direction. They didn't have to deal with tides, but it was tricky. And the British were not that familiar. They had not sailed down on the lake until that day that they came down. They'd spent all their time building the ships. So it made for an odd, almost unique, I would say, though. There was later fighting on Lake Champlain in the War of 1812, but the Battle of Valcour Island up to that time was quite unique. And the British never sailed on lakes. There were no lakes in England large enough for a sailboat.
Yeah. All right. Well, this is one of those stories that just has everything in it. I think we can agree that it really should be one of the best known stories of the Revolution. I mean, these great figures on both sides. It's got that ticking clock, that they always tell you to include in a story if you want that page turning feel, which you really capture very well. And so I want to step back to the very beginning of where you pick up the story. I think opening scenes are just key. I'm sure all writers obsess about, I usually write 5 or 6 different ones, not because I want to try them out, because I just keep changing my mind, you know, and, no, this is the right place. This is the right place. And so you must have thought a lot about exactly where to begin.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Steve, because all of history is really a continuum. So no story has a real beginning like the beginning of a book. It's always the following up on something else. And the Valcour Island campaign was really the continuation of, in the north, of the invasion of Canada. And we don't hear a lot about the invasion of Canada. In 1775, in the autumn, Americans took advantage of that corridor I was talking about and sailed north on Lake Champlain, took Montreal, went all the way up to Quebec City, and were really came close to taking that, in which case they would have controlled all of Canada. The idea of freedom-loving patriots, the first inclination being to go up and invade another province, was a little bit embarrassing, I think, in history. And the fact that they then, the campaign turned into an utter disaster when the British sent this expeditionary army over, and the first redcoats appeared, and the Americans just panicked. They fled down or really up the St. Lawrence River and all the way back to Fort Ticonderoga. And when they got there, they were totally devastated. And they also had contracted smallpox while in Canada. So I tell that story because it's, you know, you don't realize the things are going on in addition to the war. And the smallpox epidemics were a big factor in the war, actually, in the early part of the war, because the British were tended to be immune, because most people in Britain would get smallpox at some point in their life. But very few Americans had it, and the American army was very, very devastated by smallpox, particularly this army came back from Canada. So
yeah, so that's a great starting point. They're falling back. There's literally panic. You start with Arnold in this very dramatic moment, you know, being the last man out. He always had to be that guy.
Yep.
But then the disease, there are several moments where this story begins to, this always happens with history, but you really see the parallels. And the pandemic disease, you know, that's affecting the Americans at this time, and the controversy about whether to inoculate themselves. It was quite a big controversy at the time.
Yeah, the idea of vaccination wasn't invented until the 1790s. So at that time, the only thing you could do was to give yourself smallpox by what they call inoculation, or taking pus from another person and putting it in a cut on your skin. And that was dangerous, and it gave you a mild form of the disease, but not that mild. So it would deactivate men from the army, and there was a lot of controversy back and forth until finally Washington decided to inoculate the whole army so that they wouldn't be subject to these outbreaks. As I said, the super spreader event of that time was the army camp. There was no social distancing, and once one guy got it, it would spread right through the camp.
All right, so you've got a great setup for the story. This army, the American army falling back, the British are building up. You know, there's going to be some kind of showdown on the lake. And you have these great figures. At the center of it all is Benedict Arnold. And, you know, just in my experience, I used to, way back when, I like to think of it as another lifetime, I used to write history textbooks. And they would never let me put Arnold in the textbooks. Partly it was a space issue. You know, there's just no room. But there was a political element to it too. Actually, my editor once said, Benedict Arnold makes people nervous. And what he meant by that was that he was a good guy and then a bad guy. And we don't want that. You know, you actually have a line in here where you say, we like our heroes pure. And that goes very much for the textbook world. They didn't want what they consider the moral ambiguity of Arnold being a good guy and a bad guy. And I thought, well, what a wasted opportunity, not only because it's a great action story, but because that's what American history is, these stories of moral ambiguity. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about Arnold, but also about there were some other big personalities too, key figures in the American leadership in the North, and they did not always get along so well.
Yeah, I'd just start out with saying that really the three men who were given the responsibility at the beginning of the campaign were um, Philip Schuyler, who I think people around the Albany areas and Saratoga are probably more familiar with Schuyler than most people, but not a very well-known general from the Revolutionary War, and he's now his daughters are now more famous than he
right.
is, because they were in the musical Hamilton, and he was Hamilton's. He's now known as Hamilton's father-in-law, and but he was a general. He was a very wealthy man from Albany. He had some experience in the French and Indian War, but he was not a battle leader by any means. He was chronically ill. But he had been a businessman, so his contribution was really in logistics and getting the fleet built. He knew he had very wide contacts, and he was quite heroic in his own right in the first 2 years of the war, and then his career as a soldier essentially ended, and he became a politician. The man on the scene, the field commander, was Horatio Gates, who had been in the British Army. He was the commander at Ticonderoga, and Gates, like Schuyler, was also not really a battle leader, but he was really a genius of organization. Because he'd been many years in the regime of the British Army, he knew how to inflict discipline. He knew how to beef up morale. He knew how to deal with the smallpox and set up quarantine areas, improve hygiene, get the better food, and so forth. So he was able to restore that army that had come back from Canada and was so beaten up, and also improve the defenses of Fort Ticonderoga. And then Benedict Arnold, no military experience before the war, but he had I think a real intuition for military leadership. He was an inspired leader of men. He had this sense of tactics and strategy that was really quite remarkable for somebody that had not been in the Army. And the bonus was that he had been a sea captain before the war, so he was a good person to direct and then lead this fleet of boats. Knew about sailing, very energetic, very aggressive. Went immediately, as soon as he got a few ships in the fleet, he immediately sailed almost up into the Richelieu River to keep an eye on the British. So, but I agree with you. He's a problematic character. I think he's interesting because he's really a paradox. And people for probably 150 years or more tried to explain away the paradox of Arnold and say, well, he'd always been a scoundrel. He was a scoundrel from the time he was 4 years old. And that just wasn't true. You just are discarding a whole section of history in which he was very heroic up until the Battle of Saratoga, which was a year after this campaign. Very little to fault him for militarily. He was effective, and he was courageous, and he was willing to risk his life, and he certainly risked his life at the Battle of Valcour Island. So how is it then that he became such a traitor? There's really no explanation. There's no way to explain away that paradox. There were reasons. People come up with many reasons why he betrayed his country. I talk about some of the seeds of betrayal that might have been planted during this campaign. He didn't get the recognition that he deserved. He was not promoted after the campaign, which he thought he would be. And George Washington thought he would. He said, "I can't understand why you weren't promoted." Congress had, at that time, controlled all the promotions. But ultimately, other officers had similar things happen to them, and they didn't betray their country. So you can't say, well, that's just because of this or that. It's simply a paradox that's like you, I think it makes history more interesting. I think it really points to things in human nature that are interesting aspects that we all have. We all have mixed impulses. He just happened to have them in a much more exaggerated degree in both directions.
Yeah, I feel like everything he did was over the top. And it always helps. I agree to know and care about the characters in a story, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And Arnold, I mean, he had clearly motivated by patriotism, no question. He put his life on the line over and over again, but he also had a very personal motivation, which you go into a little bit as well, based on his own background and trying to restore his own family name.
Well, I find those little vignettes from people's lives and interesting they're suggestive. And Benedict Arnold had to go out as a young teenager, maybe 12, 13 years old. And his father had become essentially the town drunk. The family had been quite prominent in Norwich and around the New London area for generations. And his father essentially lost it. He suffered from depression. He suffered from alcoholism. And to have to go out and pick up your father on the street and know that he's being mocked and scorned as the town drunk, that's a tough thing for any kid. And it's not, kids weren't that different back in 18th century. And so that was something for him to acquire a name, to acquire a wealth, to acquire a business. And I think it also made him a very prickly character. He was able to get along with men under him very well, not so much with his peers and with his superiors. He was very quick to take offense.
That's another thing that jumps out as almost modern seeming. You don't want to insert anachronistic details, but you could almost hear these guys, these competing generals, you could almost hear the tweets that they would send as they're positioning themselves for what looks like it's going to be a disaster. I mean, this is the British Navy coming down, and they don't even have sailors. Arnold sends notes. I wrote down some of the quotes because they were, in retrospect, so funny. We have but very indifferent men in general. A great part of those who ship for seamen know very little of the matter. And he kept begging Gates and Schuyler for, quote, no landlubbers. Yeah. They just sent him anyone they could get, and he would say, but these guys have never been to sea. And so he was almost positioning himself with an excuse for when they lost. And everybody seemed to be doing that and passing that up and down the line.
Well, that's a good point, because it really makes it, and he was very correct about that. Most of the men on the gunboats in particular were taken from the Army. People call this the first American Navy, but it wasn't in any way an official Navy. It was a floating contingent of the Army. And many of them had been farmers before the war. They didn't know which rope to pull or what, starboard from port. And yet they were able to achieve what they did under the tremendous stress of being fired at by enemy cannon and having to maneuver the boats around and fire the guns. What the crews did was quite remarkable. And I think Arnold recognized that after the battle was over. He realized that he had slighted them perhaps more than they deserved, because they performed, these nameless men, for the most part, really performed very well in the heat of battle.
That really comes across in the book, in those very vivid battle scenes that you do a good job of conveying the chaos, but also just how long that even one day of battle must have been in those tiny boats out on the lake with no protection. And again, like you say, no experience of this. And somehow they held on throughout the day.
Yeah, the seeing people be torn apart by the cannonballs, people that people you've been living in close quarters with for months. It's it's a terrible reality to it. And I do try in my writing about the war, I've tried to get across that it's not a costume drama. This stuff really happened to real people, and it was serious business. And we all see the movies, and then you go home from the theater and it's all a fantasy. But in what happened in these various wars is a grim reality.
Yeah. All right. So I want to get to the question of why the story isn't better known. I mean, I feel like we don't know for sure, but say Homer was going to write about the American Revolution. He wouldn't write about Washington crossing the Delaware. There's just not that much there. So I think he'd focus on Arnold. I think he'd love Arnold's march to Quebec the year before through the wilderness. But the Battle of Valcour Island, I mean, come on, a make or break showdown with untrained men against the British Navy. And somehow they keep the war alive for another year. How come that story isn't? Is it just Arnold's treason? There must be more to it.
I usually cite the example of David McCullough's book, 1776, which was, David McCullough is a great historian, great storyteller, great writer. He wrote this book, 1776, very, very wonderful book about the Revolutionary War in the year 1776. There's not a single mention of the Northern Campaign in that entire book. But I think that is one of the reasons, sort of points to one of the reasons why it's been neglected. It doesn't fit as well with the story. The story he wanted to tell was the story of disaster and redemption. And that was Washington's story around New York. He got beat. He was, I compare it to the Rocky movies, where Rocky's on the ropes, he's getting beat, but in a comeback at the very end, he is able to knock out his opponent. And that was what Washington did. It's a very uplifting story. It's has a glorious ending. And the invasion of Canada and the fact of Benedict Arnold leading this campaign in the North, and the battle in the North was much less conclusive. It was like many Revolutionary War battles, it was really a defeat for the Americans, and yet it was a defeat that helped to fulfill their objectives, which was to delay and stop the British invasion. So it's not as clean and triumphant as the story of Washington. So he just decided to leave it out. I think other writers have underplayed it because of its connection to the invasion of Canada, which is somewhat embarrassing and also a great failure. But I think most of all, it's because of Arnold, Benedict Arnold. Nobody wants to turn him into a hero. And the tainting of his reputation resulted in this whole campaign being underplayed, and probably Schuyler as well, because Schuyler was not very highly thought of, and so he isn't thought of as one of the great heroes of revolution either.
Yeah, that's a good point. So what would have happened? I guess we don't know for sure, but let's go into a little more detail about 1776. Everyone knows about the Declaration of Independence. And like you say, ending with Washington crossing the Delaware. But in that middle time when Washington was losing and retreating, what would have happened if the British had swept down the lake, taken Albany, gotten access to the Hudson River? Do you think the war could have ended right there?
Yeah, I think it would have. I think that Washington was in a bad enough position. He wrote to his brother in December. He said, "I think the game is pretty near up." And that was, of course, also the time that Thomas Paine, who was traveling with Washington's army and was on the retreat across New Jersey. He wrote the pamphlet called The Crisis, and he said, "These are the times that try men's souls." And it was really 3 months after, 6 months after the Declaration of Independence, the country was really on the verge of being eliminated, and it wouldn't have taken much. And that's, one of the reasons I think that the Valcour Island campaign was important, besides the connection to Washington's army and crossing the Delaware, was that this was the British chance to win the war outright. And that's what they thought. That was their plan. They were going to win that season. And they had a lot of loyalist support. They had a preponderance of force. The Americans were at their least organized, least capable. And the fact that though they weren't beaten in the North, they were delayed, really made a difference. And that's why the attack on Trenton was important, but that's why the campaign in the North was even more important, I think, that it allowed them to continue on to the next year. And the British resumed the same strategy the next year, of course, that ended badly for them right there in Saratoga.
Yeah, right down the road from us. That's right. And you mentioned it, the loyalists, another modern seeming thing. I mean, I think you even used the sentence, the phrase, the country, this was a divided country.
Yeah, it was.
76.
Yeah. I think that, we always look at our own time as we're seeing it close up, but if you look back in history, I mean, the country was really more divided then than it is now, as far as political sentiment. They was to a certain degree, the loyalists they didn't just have sympathy for the British, they went out and fought for the British. And so it's, I think the relevance of the revolution, people have talked about the revolution quite a bit in the last year, from different directions. Some people say that it's less relevant, point to the flaws of the founders, but I think it's really continues to be relevant to every generation to look back and see, and there's always new lessons you can find. And of course, we want to look at the failures of the founding generation, but there's also the idea that they put forth. And one of the reasons I'm interested in writing about the Revolutionary War, as opposed to the sort of the ideas of the Revolutionary era, is because you're dealing with people who were willing to face those cannon, most of them inspired by an idea that they were willing to lay down their lives or take the risk. And those ideas are, they weren't rich people. They weren't, even many of the officers in the American Army were common people. That they weren't out there. They were not slave owners. They were fighting for an idea. And I think we have to at least keep that in mind, to really appreciate the impact of history on our own time.
Yeah, that's a good point. And in the research for this, did you come across, were there some of the lesser known stories or characters? There's always people I find that I would just wish I could find out more about. You have some very big personalities at the top, but were there other stories that also kind of took you off to the side a little bit?
Not so much. I can't think of too many stories. There was a gentleman named Jeduthan Baldwin, who was the engineer and very, very important in not in a battle sense, but in constructing the fortifications around Fort Ticonderoga. And also they fortified the other side of the Vermont side as well. And he was just a hardworking, he'd been a house builder and a farmer in Massachusetts, and he didn't have much training as an engineer, but he learned as he went. And he was a very interesting guy. His I believe it was his cousin was a Massachusetts farmer, and he came up with the Baldwin apple, which is still hear about the Baldwin apple. But this Juduthan Baldwin was one of the less heralded, and he kept a diary, which made it interesting. You could see him day by day going through and all that. He said, I have so much to do, and then I go to bed and try to get some sleep, and I dream about what I have to do. So we was working day and night.
Yeah, I love those snippets from diaries. You found one from, was he 13? There was a boy on one of the boats who was incredibly young.
Yeah, the nephew of one of the captains of the gunboats. To imagine, I think he was 13 or 14 at the time, and you can imagine. Oh, why don't you come along and have a little, look at what war is all about? Okay, Uncle so and so. And so he kept a short diary and recorded what he saw. It was like, it's interesting to see these things. And I, particularly from the light of someone that young, there was a letter or I guess a memoir that I came across from a woman who was a 12-year-old girl whose family was on shore, and they had to escape from between the two fleets. Where Arnold had already grounded his ships right next to their house, essentially, and the British were firing at him, trying. They were infuriated that he didn't surrender. He was burning the ships, and so this girl and her family got in a rowboat and went right between the ships, and she said, I could hear the cannonballs whizzing over my head. And later wrote about it when she was older. She wrote this memoir, and it's sobering to think about these children being involved in a war. And I think the British boats probably had their share of children, because they would take young boys on as cabin boys or ship's boys that would do the work on British ships. So that was very common in the British Navy.
So I mean, I enjoyed researching this story so much when I did it. I mean, kind of walking in Arnold's footsteps up to Canada and then on Lake Champlain is a lot easier to do now. No one's firing cannonballs at you, and you can have food, things like that, luxuries. Warm clothing. Was it fun? It must have been fun to research.
Yeah, it was. It's a beautiful area of the country, Lake Champlain area, and I had been up there many times before to Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point, and very well preserved. Fort Ticonderoga was rebuilt in the 19th century, and they have a great program there of trying to keep history alive and maintain what it's like. Not involved in this battle, but of course the Saratoga battlefield is also one of probably the premier site in the country as far as just a Revolutionary War battle site, because so many of them are gone altogether. So, it's a lot easier to imagine it when you see it there, and it hasn't changed all that much. It's sort of like I always say, I live quite close to the Hudson River down in the Hudson Valley, and there's places you can walk over the river and look and see pretty much exactly the same site that Henry Hudson saw when he came up in 1609. So those type of things are very evocative for trying to reimagine history.
They are. I remember getting in a little kayak at a time where I didn't properly know how to steer a kayak, and just going out from the shore to Valcour Island, which in the map, it's hard to get a sense of the scale. It is a lake, but it's choppy, on a really windy day. It's not what you think about tooling around a little pond in a canoe. It's not like that at all.
Yeah, I had the same experience, particularly when you're down close to the water. It's hard to imagine the map in your head, because all you see is like trees in the distance and an expanse of water, and it's hard to know if you're even looking at an island or is that the other shore on the other side. And you're right about the type of like surface of the lake is so much different than the ocean. The ocean, you're used to the large swells going up and down, whereas on lake, most lakes, but particularly a lake as narrow as Champlain, it's mostly chop, and the chop gets to be very rugged. And you can imagine these gunboats had a cannon in front, a 12-pounder cannon, weighed about more than a ton. They had to put a ton of rocks in the back to balance it. And so when it was going over these waves, it was like bouncing up and down very badly while you're trying to row to keep it moving. So it's
Incredible.
interesting.
All right, so I have plenty more, but let's pause here and give the audience a chance to jump in.
We do have a great question to kick things off from the audience from Ed. He asks, do you have any thoughts about Kenneth Roberts' depiction of this campaign in the book Rabble in Arms?
It's funny. I think Kenneth Roberts died in the 1950s. That book is, I mean, I loved it when I read it. I remember reading it years ago. And so many people have mentioned that book to me. And it's amazing how much history he got across in the book and how it really stuck in people's minds and all these years later. So he did a lot of research. It was very, I wouldn't say every word was accurate, but it was certainly a good depiction of it. And I think it sort of goes to show you good storyteller can be a really great historian in a lot of ways.
Did that cross your mind when you were writing? I know you've written fiction as well. I mean, did you think even for a second this could be, maybe I'll do this as a novel?
Not, I don't really, that didn't occur to me, but I do feel that it's important to use sort of the techniques of, suspense and as much trying to get some dialogue in that's from actual sources. But I try to write a story that people will keep reading. So that's my goal.
Yeah, it worked.
So there's a question from Bill. He asks, is it true that Benedict Arnold paid for the ships in this battle out of his own pocket? I have not heard that. He did contribute a lot of money to paying his troops, particularly earlier in the war and on the going up to Canada. He spent a lot of his fortune. He was a fairly wealthy man at the beginning of the war. But the ships were arranged for by General Schuyler, and General Schuyler had built a lot of ships already on Lake Champlain the year before for the invasion of Canada, so they were fairly familiar with how to build them. But I don't think, as far as I know, Arnold didn't contribute any money to this actual campaign.
But he did start the war as a very wealthy man. He was a very, very successful merchant in New Haven for the 10 years before the war. And through his service in the army, ended up impoverishing himself. I think one of the lesser known figures who I'd always love to know more about is his sister, who got stuck at home in charge of he had 3 kids, and his wife died early in the war.
Yeah.
And you include a letter where she writes, "We're broke." She writes, "We're broke."
Yeah.
So that's, yes, thinking about that as well as all this is going on.
Yeah, that's it's another interesting aspect that's connected to her too, is that his mother and his sister were both very devout, and they were Puritan, Calvinist, fatalistic, religious people. Arnold was not known being particularly religious, but I think he'd absorbed some of that sense of everything. We leave everything up to God's will, and what we consider extravagant risks that he took, to him was just it was fatalism. And I think some of that, he absorbed some of that in his childhood.
So Martha asks, will you be writing another book about the Revolutionary War, such as the events of 1777 and Burgoyne's defeat?
You know, I've thought about that. I'm thinking about. I'm very interested in the Saratoga campaign as well. I've actually lived for a while in Saratoga, so I'm familiar with the area, and that's of course another wonderful story of the Revolutionary War is the story of the Burgoyne campaign and Jane McCrae and everything that happened that year, and also the events out in the Mohawk Valley. So I'm always looking at the Revolutionary War has a lot of great material and a lot of material that's been written about many, many times. So it's finding a little niche, I guess, is the hard thing.
And Pat asks, could you speak about Arnold's critic, Pennsylvania Governor Joseph Reed, and some of Reed's criticisms, i.e. Arnold putting business interests ahead of the war?
Well, I think that pretty much refers to later, and Arnold was not unique, certainly, in using the war for profit. Somebody like Nathaniel Greene, who's very highly regarded and was one of the great generals of the war, when he was a quartermaster general, which Washington begged him to take over the quartermaster's position, he was making a percentage. And so he dealt with his own firms, and it was not, so nobody was pure, and it was a matter of degrees. And when Arnold had gotten discouraged and was in Philadelphia, he probably did things that were a little bit beyond the ordinary, just making a little for yourself. But by that point, I think he was the dark side of him was starting to work.
I've always thought that. I think that you're skipping ahead now a couple of years after this, after Saratoga. He was wounded terribly again at Saratoga. And then I think that was one of Washington's worst decisions of his life. Was he admired Arnold, but he and maybe because of felt sorry for him and put him in charge of essentially a military governor of Philadelphia. Could you imagine a worse person to have that job?
Yeah, particularly somebody like Arnold, who was sure to be, you know, he was a man of action. He wasn't a guy to sit around, and sitting around was bad for him. I would agree with that. And
he just drove everybody crazy, you know, everyone around him. He was a tough guy to get along with. So yeah. I mean, that was almost destined for disaster. So I mean, we know the research is fun. I always like to ask questions of writers' process. Do you come back after all this wonderful, even fun research? Is the writing a chore at that point? Do you enjoy that part too?
I'd have to say that to me, the writing is the most fun part. I like to research. It's interesting to go through, you know, the archives and find out things. But to me, just the writing, I always started out, you know, as a novelist and you just sit down and write. Yeah. And that's always been the most enjoyable part to me. So I like to revise. So I spend a lot of time revising and trying to clean up the prose. And but it's the whole thing is satisfying, let's say.
Oh, that's good to hear. And you always end up having scenes that you love but end up cutting?
Yes, I think so. You know, there's some things that you have to, it's all the story kind of dictates, and there are things that don't really fit in with the story that you'd like to, they're interesting stories in themselves, but just don't go with the flow. I deliberately kept away from a lot of the details of the campaign in Canada, simply because it's easy to get caught up in that and saying, well, I have to understand this. You got to understand the whole campaign of invasion of Canada and the march that Arnold made over the mountains of Maine. But that's such a huge story in itself. I think it was. I think it's better to leave
Yeah,
leave that as a separate story.
that is a whole other story. You're right.
So we are just about out of time, but Steve, if you have one last question that you want to get in, or if not, I have a question that I could ask.
Yeah, I mean,
also, so.
I never miss a chance to talk about Benedict Arnold, but yeah, I don't want to. Yeah, you go ahead. If you have one teed up, you should go.
I would just love to hear a bit more about the process of the building of the fleet, which is sort of an interesting story in its own right, and also a very local story.
Yeah, they set up their shipyard in Skenesborough, which we now know as Whitehall, partly because it was as far from the British as they could get, mainly because it was closer to the source of supplies, which would have been coming up from Albany and all the way down to Poughkeepsie. They would send down, there was a shipyard in Poughkeepsie, they get nautical items sent up from there. The wood was being cut and then hammered together. It was green wood, which was not good for building ships with, but they figured it's all temporary. They never painted the boats because they just didn't, they felt they were utilitarian craft that would be maybe one season, that would be it. So it was one interesting sort of modern angle on that was that at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, they built an exact replica of the ship Philadelphia, which sank, and they could measure exactly, so they had the ship to use as a model, and that actually sank several times as they were in the process of building it, because they didn't know how to properly caulk it, or they were sort of experimenting. They didn't know exactly how it was done back in the 18th century. They wanted to do as close as possible to the way it had been done then. And they found out it was much more difficult than they thought. It seemed like a fairly simple to build a large rowboat, but the process of doing that really was very important for this, like R&D for history. You know, it's like, how did they actually do it, and what do you have to watch out for? So that's an interesting thing, and it's a great teaching item at the museum. You can go out, actually get out on that ship, or just to stand on it and realize that this is the exact type of ship that was used in the battle.
And we know of at least one similar ship that's on the bottom of the lake right now, right?
Yeah, another one of the gunboats. The Philadelphia was found at Valcour Bay in the 30s and was brought up. And as you mentioned, it was now in the Smithsonian. And the other boat's called the Spitfire, is down at the bottom of 150 feet of water somewhere in Lake Champlain. They would like to get it out of there. Normally they would have left it there, be the standard, you know, survive for 250 years almost, but there's invasive quagga mussels in there that actually are deteriorating it. So they would like to get it out, but it's, you know, it's extremely expensive proposition to raise it and do it right so that it would be preserved.
Yeah.
But if anybody is listening, has any extra few $1 million, I think they've estimated 40 million to do it properly.
Okay.
It's a good cause.
Yeah, it is a good cause.
Well, that is, I think, a terrific note to end on. This has been a really fascinating evening. Thank you so much, Jack and Steve, both of you. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you, audience, for being here. Please come back to future Northshire live events, and we'll see you all again soon.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Congratulations again.
Thanks.